You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Dani Simons, currently of Alstom, to take a look back at how the Biden administration policies evolved from ideas to bills such as the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act. We also discuss Buy America, the impacts of criticisms, and the importance of storytelling. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you, as always, by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for sponsoring and supporting the show and our Monday show. We really appreciate all of your help in keeping this thing going. To join this merry band of supporters, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you'll get one of our bus-only scarves. We also have posted a few bonus materials for supporters, including extended audios from shows like our recent episode with Jillian Gillette. So check that out at patreon.com/theoverheadwire if you get a chance. And speaking of scarves, it's fall again. Get your bus and bike only scarves at the newly revamped overheadwire.com. We're sold out of the bike only heavyweight scarves, but let me know if you're still interested and we'll consider ordering a new batch as well as come up with a new design. If you have any ideas, let me know. I'm thinking about a tram or a transit or a long distance train, something about trains. We've done bikes and buses. Maybe trains is the next thing up. Maybe something urbanism focused. I don't know. We just think of some ideas, send them along. And we've also discounted the lightweight bike scarves as well. So if you want one of those for your Zoom call wall or as a fashion statement that keeps the wind and sun off your neck, check out those green bike lane checkerboard beauties as well. At the overheadwire.com website, you can find the scarves, sign up for our newsletter, get links to all the various merch, including Bookshop, Book Club, books, and the Cars Are Cholesterol merch at TeePublic, as well as our audiobook version of Town Planning in Practice by Raymond Unwin. We've also got some awesome new search features for subscribers, so check it out at theoverheadwire.com. We've got a 100,000 item newslink archive. Sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com. All you need is your email address to do so. And, you know, if you sign up and you don't get the password and the username, send me a note and I'll send you one. Or actually, just send me a note that you want to try it out. Go to theoverheadwire.com or send me a note, theoverheadwire@gmail.com. I'll just send you the thing back. Just send me a note. Hey, I want to check this out. I want to check out the archive. I'll send it right back to you. And be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube channel as well. We're starting to post some of our Monday shows over there, and you get to see my audio face, what I look like. I feel like sometimes you hear people on podcasts and you're not quite sure what they look like, and then when you see them, it doesn't quite fit, but maybe mine does. I don't know. Thanks for listening and supporting, and now let's go join the show. Awesome. Well, Dani Simons, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
Jess, thanks so much. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming back. And for folks that might not be familiar with your work or listen to episode 301 in the depths of the pandemic, can you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been working in sustainable transportation for about 25 years now. It's a field I am very passionate about. And I think for me, it's so fascinating because it touches all aspects of people's lives. And I've been very lucky to work both in the nonprofit space and local government. I think when we talked last time, I was at Waze doing public partnerships for them and working a lot on a product they had called Waze Carpool, which was an unfortunate casualty of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And I am coming to you now kind of freshly off a stint with the Biden-Harris administration, leading up public affairs for USDOT and working as the advisor for Secretary Judge.
Nice.
So I worked for the Biden-Harris administration for a little over 2.5 years, starting from right around Inauguration Day until about a year ago. And for a number of reasons, partly because I have young kids, we wanted to get back to New York and get back to a pace of life that was a little bit more sustainable. And I was trying to think about what I wanted to do next. It wasn't easy in the administration kind of environment and pace. And I was fortunate to be introduced to some of the folks at Alstom. And I was really fascinated because I had come from a place where we talked a lot about how we were going to be creating good paying jobs through all of this investment in American infrastructure and how we were going to be, creating these good paying American jobs. And I was really interested because Alstom was doing that. Alstom is a global company. It's been around for, about 100 years, is about 80,000 people around the globe, but has strong regional and local presences. And they are manufacturing trains in upstate New York. And as a person who now identifies as a New Yorker, it was exciting to me to come back to my adopted home state and to work for a company that was creating good manufacturing jobs in the state and to kind of see what it was like where the rubber hit the road from all of this like good policy talk to actually going into the private sector and understanding sort of how that worked and how companies actually operated under this Buy America framework and how companies were kind of seeing the investments in transit and rail and how they were actually, turning that funding into real projects. And so it's been a fascinating year. I've learned a lot. Some of the stuff that's happening with Buy America is really interesting to me and to kind of see where people feel really strongly and want to uphold it and where people really want to push through for the sake of expediency and want to kind of take shortcuts through it. And, policy is complicated and figuring out sort of how to implement it is complicated. And I think we're kind of at the intersection with that right now with the conversation around Brightline West and where those trains should be made.
I'm just interested in the general kind of theme about it all because, we can dive into the weeds about the Brightline West and all that stuff. But I think it's actually more interesting to talk about kind of the state of manufacturing transit vehicles and everything else in the United States versus everywhere else. And the regulations that we have that we are trying to follow, like the crash regulations that we used to have for commuter rail and trying to get around that to build train sets for Caltrain and things like that. So I feel like there's a change in discussion, or at least an evolution in discussion about manufacturing in the United States, because all of these things that we're trying to do in the United States, it's been kind of piece by piece and one off because of just the rareness of transit operations. And there's the big players like the New Yorks and the Philadelphias and the Chicagos, et cetera. But then if somebody else wants to build a commuter train in Denver, for example, then they kind of have to go and see what is out there. And I feel like in Europe, there's a number of manufacturers and people are going to buy stuff and, try to put it on their tracks, and they have regulations that work for them. And so I'm just interested in this overall theme of manufacturing US-based vehicles versus kind of the ones that exist in Japan or in China or in wherever else, It's just such an interesting topic.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting to me is like the way that Buy America works is if you have the kind of follow through and commitment on Buy America, because I think this is probably true about lots of different spaces, but you're taking the United States kind of at the start of a lot of these investments in the green economy. And I include transit and passenger rail in that, but you could look at offshore wind and you could look at electric cars and a lot of those other things as well, right? Like we just, in terms of the level of investment that we've had in those spaces and the kind of level of adoption that we have compared to China or places in Europe, it's very small. And so when you are investing, you're kind of taking a bet, and you're taking a bet on two things. One, that there's going to be some sort of continuous pipeline of funding for these types of things or consumer demand for these types of things. And two, that there's going to be some sort of long-term commitment for Buy America, because you have a government sometimes that says like, you must, there's rules from the FRA and FTA and Amtrak that like a certain percentage of the content has to be domestic content. And sometimes the threshold is very, very high. For the trains that we're building for Amtrak, I think we have about 95% domestic content. And so, you take a bet on that. But then what happens is that you have these sort of cycles of feast and famine, and sometimes just famine in terms of federal funding, especially for transit and rail. And so you might get one big contract and you might sort of live off of that for 5 or 10 years, and then it's done. And then when that happens and there's not sort of a next wave of funding that's on the horizon or present, then you have to downsize your factories. You have to, lay people off. You lose expertise, you lose talent, you lose a supply chain that might have gotten built up. And to start that back up again is, there's a lot of friction to that. There's a lot of, both in terms of time and cost to do that. And I think the kind of story that we tell about the factory in Hornell, New York, which is in the southern tier of New York, the, pretty rural part of the state, I think it's actually considered to be part of Appalachia. The factory there was pretty much almost mothballed until about 10 or 15 years ago, when we got the contract for the Acellas, for the next generation Acellas for Amtrak. And that was because the funding for transit and the funding for building rail cars just really hadn't been there for years. And so, that place was down to like a few hundred employees, and we were able to build it back up There are, I think, over 650 employees that are there now. And it's really had a huge effect on the community because when you build up a staff and a workforce, and this was a lot about what we talked about at DOT, you see that that has a ripple effect in the community because all of a sudden those people want to buy homes. And there's actually new condo development that's going on in Cornell. You've got suppliers that are coming in for visits. So you need to build a new hotel for people to stay there. And so there's a new business class hotel that's opened in the last couple of years in Cornell. And there's jobs that are associated with that. Want to go out and get a drink after work. There's a new cocktail bar in downtown Cornell called Hush. And it looks very fancy. And, you see all of this kind of ripple effect in the local economy. And that's a really good and powerful thing. But that only can be sustained if you have a steady pipeline of investment and you have a commitment to buy America. It is much cheaper for us to make stuff in Mexico. And there's times when a contract has a lower buy America content requirement, and we're going to do some part of that at our huge factory in Saguenay, which is, an hour outside of Mexico City. It's just cheaper to do it. If there is a commitment to buy America, then we will gladly also do that work in Cornell or in Plattsburgh or at one of our other facilities. And that has been creating jobs in the U.S. And I think it's a policy question about whether or not it makes sense for the government to gently subsidize in that way. And the return is creating these jobs, and those jobs in return creating more and more jobs and investment in local communities in places that really haven't seen that kind of investment and really need that kind of investment.
Yeah.
And I sit on the side of we should do that. I think that was one of the things that really inspired me about my time with the Biden administration and really made me want to come work at a company like this, and a company that doesn't just create jobs in the U.S., but creates union jobs and has been steadily working with unions, I think, in the 80s. About 1 out of every 5 Alstom employees in the U.S. is a member of a union, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, that kind of gets us into the larger discussion that we wanted to have, which is this kind of introspective thinking about your years at the Biden administration. Then also, I just hit 500 episodes today. So we're feeling a little bit introspective as well about kind of all the stuff that we've talked about over the last 11 years or so, and whether we move the needle or connect the dots in the right way. And it seems you've been feeling the same way about your time in the Biden administration. So perhaps it's a good time to ask you kind of initially what pulled you in to work there, because I feel like there's an origin story there and a start that we should go through before we get to the meaty and nitty gritty.
Well, first, congratulations on 500 episodes. That is a huge milestone. And I know that the newsletter has been going for even longer. And I'm a huge fan, and I think it's a great resource.
Thanks so much.
And I feel like that origin story is important because I think, I don't know how you feel about this. I feel like I've always sort of had this North Star in my career where I've really cared about climate and equity. And I've always thought about transportation as kind of a way to address both of those topics. And I think I was a person who, obviously I worked for the Biden-Harris administration. So that says something about my politics. And also in the last election, it was so clear to me who I was going to vote for that, to be honest with you, I didn't dive deep into Biden's policy platform before I voted for him. I just went and voted for him. Seemed clear enough. And then I sat down afterwards and, we were still deep in the pandemic. There wasn't a lot to do. I started to read through his transportation platform. And, he was known for assembling some of the best ideas from some of the other people he competed against in the primary. And what I saw in his transportation platform was just incredible to me because he really centered transportation at this nexus of climate, equity, and jobs. And I read this and I just thought aha, he gets it. This guy who's going to be the next president of the United States, gets it. This is where it's at. And I felt really excited about that. And, sometimes those visions and those words don't really carry through. And we've all seen lots of good plans and there's very little follow through and execution on them. And I think what impressed me so much was that from probably the day that he found out that he won and that he was going to be president, he started to assemble an A team of people to help execute on these ideas. And he really brought in people who were transportation experts. He brought in people from Capitol Hill who knew about how you actually drafted legislation and how you move things on the Hill. he brought in people who had worked in the past administration, who had seen what had worked and what hadn't worked, and were able to kind of like spring forward a little bit faster to start the next administration. And really, like by the time we got there on kind of day one, there was the framework of what became the American Jobs Plan was already starting to be drafted, and there were words being put on paper. And we weren't, taking the first 6 months to dream that up. Like we were ready to kind of get on it right away. And that to me was also really impressive. Like the president was someone who didn't just have a nice plan with some happy words. Like he really understood that the kind of people that you needed to assemble to try to start to execute that. And then you have, on top of that, I think his choice of Secretary Buttigieg to lead up USDOT was amazing, because I think you had a secretary and Secretary Buttigieg who is one of the best communicators in the country. And I think really helped people connect why these investments in transportation were going to make a difference in their everyday life and really help sell what became the bipartisan infrastructure law. And for me, that was just a really incredible journey our first year in office to be able to be part of that team and moving that forward.
What is that mix of people who can kind of write bills and get those things going versus like the bigger ideas? You mentioned the policy posts that were there before the election, but I'm just curious, like in terms of the sausage making, or at least the putting together the ideas on the paper that can actually be put into bills, but also make all these connections. How does that work out, or how do you put that together?
I think you had a lot of really smart people who came from, I would say, a variety of different sectors. You had Carlos Monjene, who was one of my favorite people in this experience, who was we would say S3, but the Undersecretary for Policy. And he had served under Secretary Fox in the Obama administration. And so he kind of had like a sense of the federal landscape. You had people like Robin Hutchinson, who had come in from local government from Minneapolis, and she was really driving a lot of the thinking and ideas around roadway safety. You had people like Christopher Coase, who is, brilliant on transportation policy and had, I think, a lot of vision for equity and the connections between land use and housing and transportation. You had some really smart folks who were thinking about kind of the economic pieces of this and how the kind of job creation tied and the macroeconomic pieces of this tied together. And then, like I said, you had people who had come from the Hill. You had people like Andrew Rogers and Andrew Wishnia, who both had come over from the Hill, and they both were really, really smart on environmental policy, but also really understood the ways of Capitol Hill and how to draft things and how to work with the Hill. And you had Mohsen Said, who was our Assistant Secretary for Governmental Affairs and now is Chief of Staff. And he also came from the Hill and just really understood like how to work with people and build bridges on the Hill and how to work it through. And so you had a really good combination of people who, I think that kind of mix of having some people who had really good policy ideas and some people who had the kind of pragmatic knowledge of how to make those things work in the DC context, I think was really helpful.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I also want to talk about those initial kind of pillars, and they seem like they're fairly general. So how do you get from like general to more detail?
I think one thing that I really admired about the president and about the way that this all kind of unfolded was that he did have these themes in his campaign that translated into kind of the key priorities of the White House. And I think even if you go in the next couple months to the White House website, you will still see the priorities that are listed on the White House website have stayed consistent since day one. 3 of them are around fighting climate change, advancing equity, and growing the American economy and helping build a stronger middle class. And I think those were our North Stars. And I think the granular stuff just needs to be kind of aligned sometimes to those goals. And I think there's so many things you could do and so many different ways you could take things. And I think it's helpful to have those kind of touchstones and that consistency. So you can always ask yourself, like, is what I'm doing laddering up to that thing or not? And if not, maybe it's just, not the right course, or maybe it's a distraction, or maybe it's an add-on. But I think it helps to kind of focus and helps to kind of prioritize, and also helps to kind of put bounds around things that otherwise could get quite sprawling and bewildering.
I'm also wondering kind of like how you hear the commentary on the outside. And so I'm wondering what it feels like to be inside and kind of getting bombarded with all of this. You're missing this, or you left out this, or you should have added this, or that's too much of that, or whatever it may be in terms of the gallery that's throwing tomatoes at you.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the politically correct answer to that is, you try to listen to as much as you can. You try to take it in. You try to not take it personally. And you try to figure out where there's themes and kind of things that are getting repeated and try to think about how you, maybe address that and how you do that in a constructive way. I will say just very honestly, and maybe not as politically correctly, I think that it is possible that progressives and people in progressive transportation didn't always appreciate some of the wins as much as they could have and celebrate them. I think there's a tendency to go to what's wrong. And I think that's built on like years and years of people not doing very much or doing the wrong thing, that there's a lot of distrust and suspicion. And I think there's a lot of feeling of like, well, that's what we're here for. Like in the progressive space around the left, we have to keep pushing because if we're not pushing it, we'll never get there. I just remember, and again, social media is not real life. Let's all remind ourselves that. But like, I think on the day that we announced like the first round of Reconnecting Community Awards, there was also some videos that the Secretariat put out about one of our international transportation policy initiatives, which is like a very small part of the department and a fairly small budget, but like had to be sometimes lifted up because there are people that work on that and it is important work for them. And instead of people coming out and sort of celebrating reconnecting communities, everyone was like, blah, 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 like your international policy. Why are you doing anything international? We're so far behind the world. And it's like, you guys, like we just launched the kind of biggest, most progressive new piece of funding and program that the, federal government had seen in at least 8 years, probably much longer than that. And people kind of didn't take a moment to be like, let's take like 10 seconds to celebrate that. And so sometimes that would feel difficult because you are really like in there fighting day in and day out around that. I also think that people, and I mean, this is partly like a failure of the federal government to tell its own story. It's partly because there are times when the federal government truly isn't doing a lot. And it's partly because people are busy and have a lot of other things to do in their lives other than think about this. But people don't have like the clearest understanding of what the federal government can and cannot do and sort of what is and isn't possible. And I think I, always go back to something that we talked about when I was at New York City DOT under Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, and just this idea of like, all we can do here is steer this tanker ship like a few degrees. But if we can do that at this scale, it's going to make a meaningful difference. And I think that's something that I would think about a lot in federal government. And I think was something that also sort of helped me as, some of those comments would come in and people would be saying like, what about this? And what about that? And there's too much this and not enough that.
I'm sure I've said that a few times. A number of those things being a more progressive transportation.
A lot of that is very true,
Yeah. But also it's like the expectations versus reality of like what comes out at the end versus what was promised at the beginning, right? Like you have these lofty goals and these big lists of things that you want to do, but then at the end, after all the, the horse trading and whatnot happens, you had $20 billion for reconnecting communities and you only end up with $1 billion, right? And so people are like, well, you only got 1 billion. So it's like very upsetting, even though it's like a program that is an amazing idea and something that can be built on in the future if you get the right people in office. But it's just like one of those things that I feel like there's that before and then the after, and the after sometimes is a little bit of a hangover.
Yeah. And I think one of the things about reconnecting that's interesting is like, once all the work was put in to build that program and to kind of build the policies around that, and then the funding went from this vision of the 20 billion to the 1 billion a year. And I think what happened was that people started to think about, okay, like, are there other pots of funding that can actually accomplish some of these same goals that we're trying to do with reconnecting? Can we encourage people that are coming out of the woodwork because now they've heard about this program called Reconnecting and they're kind of surfacing all of this pent up desire across the country to do projects like this? Can we direct them to other streams of funding that their project might be qualified for? And try to do that matchmaking and try to build the kind of technical capacity on the ground to be able to take federal money and put it to things like this. And so it opened up opportunities in ways that I think weren't clear to people at the beginning. And there's a lot of reconnecting projects that are happening now under the auspices of different pots of funding. So even if all of the funding wasn't in that one program, that one program helps kind of become like a front door to take in a lot of those projects. And then you can figure out different ways to help those groups find the funding because it exists. And honestly, some of that funding is with FHWA and is highway funding because you can use highway funding to build highways and you can also use highway funding to take down highways.
The funding's flexible. I feel like it's that Office Space scene with the Bobs, right? Like, I'm a people person. I take the drawings from the engineers to the people who do the work and et cetera. Well, that's interesting you talk about capacity because I think that's another thing that is part of the larger discussion of like how things get done at different levels of government and how the federal government can actually facilitate some of that sometimes. This paper that came out maybe a little while ago, but it was kind of rehashed and I posted it in the newsletter talking about, basically why road paving costs so much in some places and not others. And one of the things that came out of it was that if you have government capacity, people to look over instead of hiring consultants, you actually might be able to lower the cost. Or if you have more bidders, you can lower the cost. Or if you have, the ability to look in deeper into like what you're actually trying to get out of it, you might be able to lower costs. And so that issue of capacity is kind of an important one that I think part of this large expenditure of money builds capacity in some respects, but then you also have to be very prescriptive about it too, I imagine.
Yeah, I would also take it in a different direction, which is that one of the interesting things about the bipartisan infrastructure law that I feel like people talked about in the beginning, but just to kind of like, again, like if we are coming to the end of the Biden administration, kind of bring up is that it had an unprecedented amount of money that could go directly to local governments. And in some cases, even nonprofits and community organizations that were working on projects, which usually doesn't happen with federal money. Usually federal money, the huge majority of it flows through states. And then it's up to state DOTs to kind of do what they will with it. And there haven't been traditionally a lot of even grant programs that local governments qualify for. And so with reconnecting, it was an example of a program that cities and nonprofits could actually apply for. And it turns out that like a lot of cities and nonprofits don't have the capacity to take money from the federal government. They don't know, we don't make it as easy as we should. There's a lot of risk management and a lot of risk aversion, I would say. And I think there's also just like lots of people, just regular, normal American people who have never heard of like a STIP or a TIP or how to like get into the, transportation funding scene. And that's where you can actually start to make some difference. And if you can actually start to like access some of these federal resources, whether directly or through your state, that can be huge. And helping people kind of understand that, figure out how to do that, figure out how to be able to work in those frameworks is powerful because otherwise that money does just sort of go to the states or to cities that can afford to hire consultants that basically write these grant proposals for them or, cities that are large enough to have staff that can manage federal funding. And that, puts other communities at a disadvantage. I think one story that sort of stood out to me in terms of capacity was the kind of level of capacity that some of the tribal communities have or don't have, and what that meant in terms of resources they were able to access or not access. And our general counsel in the beginning was from Colorado, and we had I can't remember what his title was at the time. He wound up being a deputy assistant secretary for tribal affairs. And they went out on a little bit of a road trip to visit some government partners in Colorado and New Mexico. And it was during a time when we were making some of the first rounds of grants for a bridge program. And the bridge program for the first time had some funding for off-system bridges, which meant that local communities could actually apply directly for the funding and didn't have to necessarily all to the state. And usually these bridges kind of wound up being last on the list of priorities for a state because they were, small bridges, low volume of traffic, but they had gotten into, pretty awful state disrepair because there had been such underinvestment. And John and Orlando sent back these photos from New Mexico, from a tribal community that was relying on pontoon bridges that had been surplused after the Vietnam War. These were meant to be temporary bridges used in a time of war to get across rivers in the rainforests of Vietnam. And tribal communities in the year 2022 were still using these as their lifeline and their link to all sorts of services. If you had to drive to the doctor, you were driving over these Vietnam era temporary bridges. And I think that says something about the capacity of these communities to be able to access the types of money it takes to be able to build the kind of infrastructure that you need. And we should be able to expect that every American should have access to, that they should be able to have a safe bridge and good working order that they can use to get to the doctor's office if they live in a rural community. And so there was some stuff like that that I really thought about a lot in terms of both capacity building and then also sort of where we were able to have some funds go more directly to some of these smaller communities.
Yeah. We would talk with folks from National League of Cities, and they set up a system for helping smaller communities and folks with less capacity to apply and to try to get the grade. And it's interesting to hear how many places need that help, because it is a complicated process. And I understand a lot of it's to keep down waste and fraud, and there's good reasons behind a lot of the regulations and stuff, but it also is very hard for some places to go after some of these funds that they desperately need.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to go back and look at that American Jobs Plan fact sheet from March of 2021 and see what was followed through on, but also, look back at it with some 2020 hindsight. I'm wondering if there's anything in that plan that stuck out to you that wasn't there, or maybe things that were there that you were excited made it through the process.
There is a lot in there. I feel like I sort of fell in love with that plan when I first started it. And it's probably a bad idea to fall in love with things like that because they're always subject to change. And there's a lot in there that I was excited about in terms of workforce development and training that didn't really wind up getting through. And some of it came through in CHIPS, and some of it came through in IRA, and little parts of it came through in the bipartisan infrastructure law. But, I think that there was some really great stuff in there. There was some really great stuff in the American Jobs Plan about the care economy. And I think that feels really important to me as a mom, and also, someone who is hopefully a few years away, but kind of in the squeeze generation where my parents are getting older and I have young kids. And I think I have a lot of hope that maybe we will be able to get back to some of that, because I think those things were really important for the people who do that work, because those are very hard jobs. I think in terms of what did come through, I mean, even though at a lower dollar value, the Reconnecting Communities program, I think, is one that I feel very passionately about. And I think, it's one where when you kind of look at some of the projects that are getting funded and look at the impact that's having on those communities, I think I just feel proud that we were able to get that done, and hopefully it will continue to grow over time. I would travel with the secretary a fair amount, but there were lots of times when I felt like I was kind of home in the back office, minding the shop, and had a lot of great people on the road. But I would often tune in when he would do a press conference, because I like to hear, how his speeches went, and I'd like to hear the questions that reporters were throwing, and it just helped me with my job. And, a lot of times you watch one of these things and you kind of, you're like, you watch them all, and there's not that new stuff. But the one for the Reconnecting Communities grant that was given in Buffalo for the Kensington Expressway, I tuned in, and it's Majority Leader Schumer and Governor Hochul, and there's the congressman and the mayor, and it was a whole host of politicians standing up. And then this woman stood up, probably like somewhere between mid-60s and mid-70s. And her name was Stephanie Barber Geeter. And she just touched my heart. Like, I think I cried when I watched her give her speech. And she just reminded me of people I had worked with earlier in my career in Providence and in other places. And she stood up and she said, I want young people to know that nothing happens quickly. And she said that with like this weight of like experience. And then she said, but elected officials for once in my lifetime gathered together and decided that they would deliver the goods to the community. And we were almost in shock. We were like, okay, we heard that before, right? But guess what? They brought home the bacon. And she went on to talk about kind of the experience of working on this project for years and years and years. And, always hearing that people supported what they were doing and were trying to kind of cobble together bits and pieces of it. And finally, there was this program that actually are letting them get going to put this community vision into action and to finally do this project. And it's going to include local hire provisions that Senator Jill Brandon worked on and help support some of the local businesses there. And you can just see what an impact this is going to have. And there are tens of thousands of projects like that going on now across the country that have been on someone's list, maybe in a plan on a shelf for years and years, that are finally getting done. And that's incredible. And I think a lot of them are projects that have something to do with safety, which I feel like is really tied to climate inequity. They have things to do with climate, whether that's resilience or fighting climate change. They have to do with equity, whether that's a reconnecting project or whether that's making sure that people have better access to transit so they can get to jobs. And it's kind of hard to tell the story of that, like in its totality. And people talk a lot about like, why isn't this more of a national story or why hasn't this like broken through? But it's a story that's touching tens of thousands of places across the country. And I think that kind of it's more of a quilt that gets knit together than like one, final picture that you see on a wall, maybe more of a mosaic than like a painting.
I feel like reading the plan made me kind of mad at politics. So I realize that people don't want to sit down and read these papers and manifestos, but there are really things that impact people's lives in there. And more so than maybe some of those political hot topics that are on the news shows every single day or in your Twitter thread every single day. And it's frustrating because those things, the little things, matter a lot to a lot of people, but we end up talking about all this other stuff that in the end might impact a couple of people and it might move the needle in terms of voters because it's such a hot button topic. But in the grand scheme of things, maybe it just doesn't matter as much as this does, as infrastructure, as care economy, as the things that, we care about.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think the president and I think Secretary Buttigieg were both really excellent at always bringing it back to how this was going to make a difference in people's lives. The secretary was really focused on, how is this going to be something that matters to people? People would come up to him when he was mayor and they would come up to him at the grocery store and talk to him about the pothole they needed sold on their corner. And he had a great rap and really talked about how, infrastructure is like kind of the fundamental underpinning for everything else that we do in our daily lives, but that people shouldn't have to really think about it, right? Like people want to just take it for granted and they only really talk about it when it's not for them. And we should be doing more to make it work for people so that they can go on about their daily lives and do all the things they need to do. And it's not a tax on their time. It's not unsafe for them or making them feel like their kids are unsafe. It's just helping them, live a life where they have access to opportunity and they can do the things they need to do.
I feel like, and this isn't like a knock on the secretary, but like as somebody who's deep in the weeds every day, and I'm not everybody, right? I'm in this space where I just get so much information and I can get bored pretty easily with some of the stuff. But just like watching him go on James Corden or on Stephen Colbert, which I watched really a lot during the pandemic, I got bored with him talking too, because it's like all these like higher level platitudes and things that are above. And I was like, I want you to get into the weeds. I want you to get into details. Like, I don't think Stephen's actually going to ask you about, transit manufacturing or whether, the size of vehicles is too big for pedestrians that are dying on the roads every day. And so I think that's an interesting perspective from me, but a lot of people probably don't share that.
I will say, if you ever wanted to go into the weeds with him on a topic, like definitely hop in the car with him when he's on his way to prep for any sort of like press event or public speaking. And he will grill you for like an hour and a half on the ins and outs of like how, the FAA policy works and like how the air traffic control systems, radar regions, the, different technologies inside the plane and like just wants to know every single detail about every single thing. So he is definitely in the weeds. I think he does realize that most people who are watching Colbert aren't necessarily there with him.
I understand that completely.
He does kind of try to translate that into language that regular folks can resonate with. But yeah.
But nerds like me want that conversation in the car. Maybe like that's the thing is like maybe the next secretary or if Pete lasts longer, I don't know if he wants to go and do other things. It seems like a busy job, but it feels like there's a lot of folks in the spaces that we run in that would love to see like that podcast, right? Or that trip to work where you talk about the details. And there's lots of potholes in that too, right? Because if you show that, the behind the thinking, then, it's easier to pick apart things as well, I guess, too.
Yeah. I mean, I do think there were some places where he would kind of go a little bit more into the weeds if that was kind of the audience. There was a woman named Carrie, who was our press secretary, who now is in my old job, who I really loved working with. And I think one of the things that she was great at was really making sure that we followed through on the vision of making sure he was talking to audiences that transportation secretaries didn't always talk to. And so sometimes that would mean like talking to popular mechanics and like going really granularly into like he always really loved to talk about recycled asphalt pavement. Like that was like a big thing for him, and like alternative technologies for asphalt. And like he would really go deep in the weeds there. And there's definitely times he did interviews about that. And then sometimes he would be talking to like, I think he did one of the things that Carrie did, it was right after I left. He did an interview while running with Runner's World to talk about roadway safety because runners happen to really care about roadway safety, but
Yes,
it wasn't like a topic that you would usually see in Runner's World that much. So, really trying to match kind of the level and tone of what he was talking about to the audience and find a way to connect to people where they were, which I think was really important for him.
When I ran at the University of Texas, we hit our fair share of car hoods and got calls from those people to our coaches saying that we messed up their cars, but they were going to mess us up worse. And so our coaches were okay with it to a certain extent. They couldn't say that outwardly, but I bashed a couple of hoods myself. No damage, but just don't run me over when I'm running.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Self-defense.
How hard is it to create like an actual theme behind transportation spending aside from like creating jobs and fixing broken things? I mean, the thing that we talk about on the podcast a lot of just this idea of access, right? And thinking about that in a greater context. And so I'm wondering about that theme building and how that works.
I mean, for us, the theme building was really from the top down. Like the president's priorities were, helping fight climate change, advancing equity, creating good paying American jobs, and really, restoring the American economy and building a stronger middle class. And I think those were the themes that we were working with. And I'm sure different administrations were different ways. For me, it was helpful to have those as North Stars throughout the work that we did and kind of to be able to stay in alignment. And I think we were successful in that. And I think the kind of themes you saw running through the American Jobs Plan and then saw running through the bipartisan infrastructure law really tack to those pillars. And I think it's helpful to keep a group of people. It's 50,000 people across USDOT. A lot of them are at FAA, but, even if it's like 10,000 people that are working on this, like, more directly, it's hard to keep those people aligned. It's hard to keep people marching in the same direction. And so to have some of those key themes are very important, I think, to kind of guide people at that higher level. And, there's really talented people who are career staff at USDOT who are very passionate about roadway safety. Some of them are very passionate about innovation. Some of them are very passionate about climate equity. They, span across administrations, but they're really looking to the political appointees and to the leadership for kind of how they move and what they prioritize. And so having those clear themes and continuing to repeat them and not having those change every single day is really important for steering a ship that's the size of that organization.
What frustrates you?
One thing that really frustrated me that I feel like I still take personally after all this time, even though it's not about me, but it's about someone who I really cared about. I don't know how many people listening know the name Stephanie Pollack and how people are followed in this space, but Stephanie Pollack was the acting administrator for FHWA. She had come from MassDOT. Stephanie had served under both Democrats and Republicans. She is a person who speaks her mind and a person who was very clear coming into the administration that she was there for a good time and not a long time. She was someone who always spoke her truth and someone who really, I think, pushed us to a higher standard. And Stephanie, I don't think she knew how much of a limb she went out on, but she kind of went out on a limb and crafted a memo that went out with FHWA funding that internally had the horrible nomenclature of the BAM memo, the Building a Better America memo. And the memo basically said something that used to be so common sense that Mitt Romney embraced it, which was just like, you should prioritize state of good repair before you build new stuff. And you should prioritize safety in every single project that you do. And it was a policy model, like it was a suggestion. It was like a suggestion to the FHWA regional administrators of things to consider when they were working with their state partners. It was not binding in any way. It was not legally required. It wasn't putting new restrictions on grant money. It was just like hey, we're new in town. This is like our sort of philosophy for how we're going to approach things, just so everyone knows these are some kind of things we should be considering when we're looking at these projects. That became a huge lightning rod. That was something that the Republicans hit and hit and hit and hit and really weaponized, even though it was like such a common sense, truly fiscally conservative way to approach things. it just became like another flashpoint that they were trying to kind of make into a culture war. And it's really unfortunate because I think it was personal. They went on attack around a lot of especially a lot of the women who had been appointed to acting administrator roles, and they tore into them. And it was very disheartening to see, I think, between Stephanie and Carlson, who had been heading up NHTSA, who, although, didn't have as much safety background, I think, as people wanted, had a phenomenal environmental background and was doing a lot with the kind of emission standards piece of the work that NHTSA does, and a couple others. And it was just really hard to watch that part of it. That was very frustrating. It was like to think about the fact that like you had to uproot your life, take a shot that your career was going to be better after serving in an administration, that you were actually going to be able to get something done. You were bringing a very specialized skill set, and then you would come in and try to get something done. And like, you weren't being attacked on your ideas. You were just being attacked surely for like a political talking point. Was a really tough thing to watch and demoralizing, frankly.
Yeah. The state DOTs don't want to be messed with, it seems like, and they really should be. Is that where that came from?
I think the state DOTs don't want to be messed with, but really, I think that, I try to be as bipartisan as possible. I think transportation is bipartisan, but I think that there are a group of Republicans who are doing everything they can at every moment to try to just win political points and to try to paint anything that the, Democratic administration was doing as like so far left that it was just like so out of touch with the American people. And anytime they could find a way to do that, they would kind of pounce. I have this amazing screenshot, which I could also send to you, from Fox News, and it's the Laura Ingraham show. And the headline in the background is like Secretary Pete, Highway to Hell. And it was like him with like, he had drawn devil horns and like flames were like coming out behind his head. And I can't even remember what that was about, to tell you the truth, but it was like a moment. He probably said something about roadway safety and like people shouldn't speed because that's dangerous. And they were like all over it. It doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter that that's common sense, that they also want their kids to like live to see another day. They just see a political point and they're there to press it, and they're there to kind of jump on that. There's another screenshot that I took. I can't remember if it was Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert, but like went on some tear about like electric vehicles and electric vehicles threatening people's manhoods of their Secretary Buttigieg. I'm like on CNN and the Chiron or something like, Secretary Buttigieg says his car is not related to his vision of his manhood or something. And it's like, I can't believe that this is happening. Like, I can't believe that I'm even seeing this with my own eyes, that this is on like a major cable network. It's just ridiculous. That stuff was not my favorite part of it. I feel like we got a lot of good stuff done. I feel like we were always navigating around those kind of potential landmines. And, partly the downside of having a very high profile secretary and became, sometimes a lightning rod for stuff like that. And some of the people in his administration that were kind of the next tier down also kind of took some of that heat as well.
How hard is it to not poke that bear, though? I mean, like, safety is, that memo was pretty simplistic, like you said. And we've worked with Stephanie before. When I was at RA, I did some TOD planning with her. She's a pretty smart person and really thoughtful. And I feel like it seemed silly for this thing to blow up about this little memo. But was it because of the memo, or is it because they wanted just to find anything that they could to press on?
I found that social media would become like kind of a proving ground, and they would kind of like text some stuff out, see what stuck, and then they would try to pop that into more mainstream media, or they would try to pop it into like a hearing, or sometimes like a hearing would become like a proving ground, and they could see if like the things they were saying in the hearing then got picked up in the media, and then they would like continue to kind of press on it and make it a bigger deal. I think that the BAM memo was like a combination of things. I think some of it was like they did get some press pickup off of it, and they thought it could be effective in talking about how we were like, anti-highway or against building new roads, because that was like a huge, headline, which was like, of course, the opposite. Like, the people on the left were like, you guys are building too many new roads. And the people on the right were like, you guys want to, not just like not build new roads, you want to tear them down. Like, you're crazy. Mm-hmm. Which is probably how we knew we were like somewhat of the middle space. So I think that was part of it. I think, to your point, like, there were a lot of state DOTs that still feel like they want the freedom to do what they want to do. And there's some great state DOTs that are taking a more climate-centered approach now, which is great to see. Colorado being one of them, for sure, and California, and a few others. There were other folks where it was just truly about the politics, and they they could go really hard and they would politicize things. And Carlson was on loan to us from the UC system. And for years, right-wing think tanks and interest groups have had a tactic with the UC because California has some of the most robust and extensive sunshine rules in the state of just papering them with requests for documents. And because the university system doesn't have the hugest budget in the world, they don't have like a very baroque legal team that just like fends these off like one after the other. Like professors, if there's like requests for documents, have to make them available. And so people working on climate issues would just constantly be attacked with like this weaponization of requests for documents that basically took hours of their time away from their research and away from their teaching. So she was already subject to that in the UC system. And then when she was up for confirmation hearing, there were people who were actively trying to tear her down. They were trying to get her fired from her old posts at the UC system, in addition to just not getting her confirmed. And it was, that was wild to watch. And that was a lot about just the politics of going after a woman who actually did a lot of research about climate change and law.
Yeah. What should we think about the legacy of all of the bills that passed? I mean, it's impressive that they got passed. I mean, it was a vote here and there that could have or couldn't have happened, obviously. The plans are put together, but passing them is what really matters in the end, right? I'm wondering what the legacy is going forward.
I think the legacy of this bill is going to be fundamentally, there are going to be jobs today and in the next 5 to 10 years. And there's going to be a stronger foundation for the American economy going forward. One of the first trips that I took was to Pittsburgh. And we got on a barge and we rode underneath some of the bridges that span across Pittsburgh, which are, legendary. But these bridges were built over a century ago. And I can't remember whose speech it was, but one of the elected that spoke at the press conference that day, said something which really resonated with me, which is like, if you brought back the workers who built these bridges and showed them that their work had stood the test of time, I'm sure they'd be proud. But they'd also be confused as hell as why it took us so long to just build a new one, because they could do it 100 years ago. Like, what became so hard that we don't build new things now? And that's very important for us to be able to have a strong competitive economy. But I think that the way that the policies have been written and the programs have been written, my hope is that more of these projects are going to be better for the environment, better for equity, safer, and that we're starting to kind of turn that ship by a few degrees. I think this is a 5-year bill meant to be spent over 10 years. And so I think it's going to be both a long-lasting but also kind of slow-moving transformation. And that's always a complicated thing for politics. Like, people want to see things in a year or 2 years or 4 years. And this is going to take a little bit longer than that, because the projects that we're building are going to hopefully last for the next 25 or 50 years. Hopefully, it won't have to last for 100. And the other thing I think is, for people now to start mobilizing and thinking about what they want to see, and whether that is a reauthorization of this bill or a next transportation bill, and how we keep raising the bar from where we are here.
Yeah. I'd love to see a next one focus on access to a lot of things: care, infrastructure, health, all that stuff, and more broadband thinking about public goods and whatnot. Dani, where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
People can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, probably most of all. And I welcome engagement and being found, and happy to continue the conversation with folks out there.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. And congratulations on 500 episodes. And here's to, I think, 500 more.
Oh my gosh.
Should I wish that on you?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Do it.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com, or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.